Okay, as promised, a video about the never-ending whirligig of excitement, that is drainage. Now, this really is just about drains, so if you think I'm joking... Okay, so when you're buying a house in France, apart from the cost of the house and the associated fees, of course, there are basically three things that can bite you in the bum from an unexpected cost perspective. Firstly, roofs. Now, for some reason these are hellishly expensive in France, I don't know why. Secondly, electrics. Old houses can have very old electrical installations, so sometimes a full rewire is the easiest thing to do. All the anomalies on the electrics are shown in the diagnostic report, of course, that you get with your conform. And thirdly, drainage. Now, the house you buy, in theory, will be on either mains drains. This includes Fosse collective, which are basically big septic tanks that serve a number of houses, usually a whole hamlet. These are what you see sometimes driving around the French countryside, or it will have its own septic tank. Okay, we'll start with the slightly easier one of the two. If the house is advertised as being on mains drains, then as part of the sales contract, the seller has to provide an attestation saying that the mains drains installation conforms to all the current norms. Now, who provides this varies from region to region. Mostly in this area it is Saur, spelled S-A-U-R, who are one of the biggest French water companies and have responsibility for the mains and sewage. Saur will come out, for a fee of course, and check that all the wastewater flows into the drains correctly. Now, this process only became a legal part of the sales process relatively recently. So there are a lot of people who have houses on mains drains who've never had them checked. In fact, I sold a house a few years ago in the middle of a village where all the other houses were on mains drains. She'd bought it on the assumption that it was on mains drains, but when we came to check, Saur pumped a load of blue smoke down the toilet, not just for fun, but because the water wasn't connected, to see where it came out. There was a prolonged period of silence. Then a blue haze started rising up out of the back garden, coming out of some old derelict septic tank, which was a bit of a shock to everybody, but especially the owner. Of course, you can buy a house where the mains drains isn't up to scratch, but a line has to go in the contract about who's going to pay for the work that needs to be done. This usually means that the owner has to get a devis or a quote for the work. The usual outcomes are: 1, the owner agrees to make everything comply before the sale, and it's then rechecked. 2, the buyer says he'll take full responsibility for the work. He then, in theory, has 12 months after the sale to make everything good. Or 3, the buyer and the seller agree to split the cost. Now, if it's not on mains, then the house theoretically has a Fosse septique or a septic tank. This also has to be checked. Doesn't matter if it's a derelict house that hasn't been lived in for 300 years and quite obviously doesn't have any kind of drainage, the owner will still have to get the installation or the non-installation checked and pay for the privilege, of course. Who does this check, again, varies from region to region, but around here it's predominantly the delightfully named SPANC, which stands for, wait for it, Service Public d'Assainissement Non Collectif. Again, once an offer has been accepted, the owner will contact SPANC. In an ideal world, he'll have done this when he put the house on the market, as the process can take some time. Who will, in a similar way to the mains drains, come out and do a control on the installation to see if it conforms. Now, what's important to bear in mind is that a system that works fine, with no problems, can easily not conform to the current norms. If a tank doesn't conform, and a lot don't, then the options are similar to the situation I outlined earlier with mains drains. The buyer can insist as part of the negotiation that the work is done prior to purchase, or the buyer can accept full responsibility to fix any problems or install a complete new system. If they do this, then they'll have 12 months to do the work after the day of the sale, or a buyer and seller can agree to share the cost. Again, for most outcomes, a devis or a quote for the works will be required. These costs can literally range from a few euros for a missing ventilation pipe to the most expensive one I've seen, which was 28,000 euros for a new septic tank for a property that sat on stilts in a lake where the tank had to be brought in over massive pine trees on a huge crane. That was an entertaining day and not in the slightest bit stressful. As I say quite often, the seller has not had this report commissioned before finding a buyer. But you, as a buyer, can give yourself an idea of any glaring issues if you remember the following rules. Now, this is a diagram of a standard installation which also shows some of the regulations. So if the sellers do know the size of a tank, then the minimum size is 3,000 litres, or 3 cubic metres for a property with 3 bedrooms or fewer. You'll need to add another 1,000 litres for each additional bedroom in the house. The septic tank must be installed at least 7 metres away from the house. If the septic tank is installed more than 10 metres away from the kitchen, it will need to have a grease trap or a back of grass to avoid blocking the system. The tank cannot be installed within 3 metres of any neighbouring properties, and the tank cannot be installed within 3 metres of any trees or big shrubs on the property. There must be a distance of 35 metres between the tank's filter bed and any water sources on the property, such as rivers or streams or more usually wells. Rainwater must not be allowed to enter the septic tank, so there must be an alternative drainage system to avoid this. And the tank must be properly ventilated and easily accessible by a covered manhole or a regard. The filter bed must also have 2 regards, one at the start and one at the end. And one other important thing to remember is to check with your local mairie that mains drains is not planned for your house or hamlet anytime soon. Otherwise you can end up spending €10,000 on a new tank when you could have spent significantly less connecting to the mains. There are other options to traditional tanks, like systems known as microstations, but I can cover those in another video. I can sense the excitement from here. Now, I know this all sounds a bit daunting, but like everything in France, as long as the paperwork is done properly, then there really should be no problems. I hope that all makes sense. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers.